You're tuned into Auto Intelligence, live from Auto Trader, where data, tools, and your preferences sync to make your car shopping smooth.
They're searching inventory.
Oh, yeah.
They find what you need.
They're gonna find
and
it.
You can make a budget for your wallet to help you succeed. Pricing's precise and true.
So true.
It's smarter car shopping.
Ooh.
Just for you.
Oh, it's just for you.
Ooh.
Find your next ride at autotrader.com. Powered by Auto Intelligence.
What if buying a new appliance felt like a win for your home and your wallet? Save up to 50% plus up to an extra $600 on select major appliances at the Best Buy Appliances Labor Day sale. Learn more at bestbuy.com. Best Buy, imagine that.
Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Room, a horror video game podcast and proud member of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger.
And I'm the other one, Neil Bolt.
And this week we're exploring the haunted halls of Luto from developer Broken Bird Games, in which players assume the role of protagonist Sam, who finds himself stuck in a time loop, unable to leave their home. As the player ventures deeper into the house, they uncover the deeper recesses of Sam's mind, revealing more confounding barriers for the player to overcome. And as the game itself is upfront about this, Luto's narrative deals with themes of abuse, anxiety, depression, and suicide, which we're naturally going to be delving into during the course of our chat this week, so fair warning in that regard. So I don't think people could really be blamed necessarily from taking a look at Luto from afar and thinking, oh, what does this resemble naturally? Any number of walking simulator, haunted house games, or more specifically, PT, right?
Yeah.
I think that when you kind of look at the Steam page, it's one of those things where you're like, oh, this visually is very, very appealing and a gorgeous looking game at that. It clearly deals in some surreal subject matter or visuals at the very least. But at the same time, like, we're so inundated with games that clearly were influenced by PT. Not that there's an issue with that, but more often than not, I think we've seen that when games are kind of like chasing this trend or what was popular prior to its actual release, that they kind of latch onto the wrong aspects of it, right? I think much like in the wake of things like Gone Home, right? Walking simulators, those games got a bad rap for people that have this overly simplistic sort of idea of what they were, descriptions of them. And I find that there's been a lot of games in the last, I mean, God, how old's PT now? Almost 10? Like, there have been plenty of games that have had this level of visual fidelity to them, but at the same time, they kind of lack the actual essence of what PT had. PT was not just all about jump scares, right? There were some, but that was not what made PT like a differentiating experience from something like Layers of Fear, right? That's the type of thing that, you know, we've talked about way back in the day for Safe Room, but we could chat just like briefly about it, like our kind of general feelings about walking simulators, and maybe like the inherent strength of that subgenre. Like for you, what is an aspect of walking simulators that you find actually like justifies that description of them, that actually goes beyond just like aimlessly walking, which is what some people, you know, think that genre is all about?
Well, I think the sort of emergence of them and when they came up is quite telling. It came at a time when game worlds were becoming more sort of sprawling in the bigger budget things, and you kind of lost some identity in that, you know, the bigger you build your world, the less chance you're going to have a lot of detail. And actually, like, one of the very select few that can just imbibe so much detail into everything, because, you know, you've got a unified vision, if you will, but certainly the bigger games didn't do that so much. And here, the strength is always, pretty much always, the worlds in which they inhabit, which are smaller, more thoughtful, and generally done to an artistic vision that's based on what the narrative is telling you and how and what you need to see, like that. So this is why it then feels more like interactive fiction, if you will, to some people, because you're being presented it in much the same way you would a film or even a book, really, just without the imagination parts, in that sense. But you're getting something that feels more creative, I suppose, in a more distilled sense. I think that's the important thing there. You do get a better sense of where the focus needs to be. And yeah, when I think of all the great sort of games in that mold, the worlds are always the thing that kind of sell them. I mean, there's something about them that does a great job of telling a story, whether that be because it's just set in a very nice place, or if like there are these particular quirks, stuff like What Remains of Edith Finch, which I'm sure I mentioned more than once in relation to this game. Is a great example of that, where it's like it's telling a very relatable story, but it's putting little fantastical spins on it within the same household. And it's a household that's got all these normal family things, but also it's structured in a way that doesn't feel like a place you could actually legally build, which is fine. And shouldn't legally stand, but that's great. So it's like that sort of Tim Burton Big Fish style sort of fantastical retelling of a history, which is great. And you getting to sort of live in that and live in these moments makes it sort of that wonderful amalgamation of what those games do so well. That's why that's probably one of the standout sort of examples in the overall genre. But I think you've got to create a good detailed world. I think Amnesia: The Dark Descent just turned 15 this week as well. So within the sort of first person horror space, especially one where combat is avoided, there has to be something else to sort of sink your teeth into. And the world does a lot of the storytelling that even maybe the endless notes don't always have to be the only source of sort of narrative income.
Yeah, I've always been such a fan of walking simulators because of the fact that they let you explore basically like lived in spaces, right? And I think over time I've become such a fan of environmental storytelling, and there really is no better example of that for the most part, I think, than when you're talking about walking simulators. Something like What Remains of Edith Finch, as you mentioned, or Gone Home. I think Firewatch was one that had much more of a narrative that kind of like sidesteps what is usually the case, which is exploring a space, but the space itself, you feel like, oh, well, I'm showing up 5 minutes after somebody else just left this space, kind of a thing. Like with Everyone's Gone to the Rapture, which is another game that I absolutely love. And the fact that you can walk through this space and have this ominous feel to everything, and you can almost feel like the essence of the people that were, basically just burst into what you assume is like dust, essentially, right? And that's the type of thing where that is not effective unless the attention to detail in the environment is as strong as it is in all the games that I just mentioned. And so for me, like the notion that walking simulators are not worth my time because they quote unquote just involve walking, like that's always been a notion. And we've chatted about it for plenty of times over the years, where it's this thing where it's like, well, there's so much more to games than just the type of typical agency, if you will, right? It's like you don't always have to have something to do in a traditional sense of interact with this object, solve this puzzle, handle this firearm type of a thing. It's like, oh, you can have spaces that are able to be themselves like a character. And I think, something like Layers of Fear, which we've also talked about a good deal, which is a game that we both enjoyed. Like, I find that type of experience really works for me when it's done by a developer like Bloober that really understands like how to utilize that to the best of their ability. And more importantly, I think the length of an experience, because there's definitely been Layers of Fear type clones that I've played that did not respect the amount of time that their experience was, and very quickly got burnt out on them because it felt like the same thing over and over and over. Whereas Layers of Fear, for what people could say about it being like, yeah, it's jump scare heavy, and every time you turn around, the door you just walked through disappeared. I still find that like more often than not, that first game is paced pretty well, and the attention to detail in the environment is of a caliber that I think exceeds a lot of them that we've played. And, when thinking about Ludo, the obvious comparison point would be PT, but also I thought a lot about Visage, which we had covered recently. And that being a game also that, it has the haunted house framework to it, but at the same time, it also is delving more into like the psychological horror, and it's not as preoccupied with jump scares in your face type of moments like something that Layers of Fear would. So I think in that regard, like Ludo felt, I went into Ludo, I suppose, feeling like I knew what to expect from this game, but
Yeah.
at the same time, it very quickly became apparent that like that's kind of the point behind Ludo in a way, right? It's that we're presenting you with something that is very familiar. It's not hard to ease into this world. And that's really where the game is able to kind of like build upon that notion of the player feels comfortable with what they're doing, before they're able to kind of like pull the rug out from under you in several ways, which I think is probably one of the most enjoyable aspects of Ludo.
Yeah, it really is. And I think giving you this very early on, this like hook of what could be going on, and little touches. It was like I say, it's got you on the hook very quickly for, okay, so where's this going? What's that doing? And it's structured in a way that, again, there'll be comparisons to other games in terms of like the way it is, the story is displayed to you and how it kind of obscures where you think you're going, and it takes you down different little pathways. So even though you kind of get more and more of a grip of what is going on, there are still other levels to it that kind of suggest other things to it as well, so it kind of keeps you guessing throughout, in terms of without being like shock horror, kind of twists and turns sort of thing. It's just more of I suppose the thing I'd like to compare it to, it's that sort of utilizing tropes to sort of tell us something a bit warmer maybe than we might have expected. Despite the darkness and all the themes you kind of recalled at the beginning, in terms of what this game has, and it is trying to do a ghost story in a way that is about like the love and family and things like that, which and it's something I've mentioned more than once. I think in recent history is Steven Soderbergh's Presence, which again, a film that utilizes the ghost story in a very different way and tells a very different story for it. I'm definitely here for that as well with this game. When I saw the trailer and sort of the game sort of hooked me as in to buy it. It was that trailer and just saying that this is a ghost story, and the way it was put, I was thinking this feels like it will be more like a Layers of Fear or even an Edith Finch rather than Outlast or Visage, or Madison or something like that, where it feels like you are going to be attacked every 5 minutes and probably will be, and it gets that horrible loop. A problem that I suppose people did have with those kind of games, at the start of it was, why can't you defend yourself? Why can't you do this? Why am I being chased? Why this ruins the storytelling for me because I'm dying here or doing that, and it's something when we were discussing Amnesia Rebirth, it was a game that took that sort of idea of like, well, that stuff can still happen, but you can continue the narrative by making that a part of the narrative. And that worked really well for it. So it handles things in a way that it was intriguing straight away for me in terms of like it being, knowing it would probably be like that kind of game, but it's still being able to create moments of tension and unease, that we'll get into in a bit. But that's great. That's kind of what I want. I don't really want if I want the survival horror experience, give me a survival horror experience. Like that's fine. If you're telling me a story and you want to tell it in your own way, then you don't want to have combat, great, that's fine. And this game definitely excels at that.
Yeah, that's also been a really interesting conversation we've had previously. The notion that you actually don't need combat in a horror game, right? And the fact that, if anything, like those experiences can be more terrifying by the lack of the ability to fight back. But I think that For me, like just going into Ludo pretty blind, right? That's typically how I go into anything that you recommend because I'm just like, well, Neil said it, we got to play this. So it's like, yeah, I want to go in. I know it's probably defying some of the general, like, if you pick a game that looks like Ludo that I might, or people might have the assumption like, oh, it's just like PT. It's like, no, Neil's not really going to pick something like that. You're going to pick something that probably defies those expectations. And again, like I was talking about, the notion that this is a game that presents very familiar, I think is again one of the strengths to it, right? Because let's just basically do a quick rundown of that, which is that first and foremost, this game looks gorgeous, right? That's usually a factor of a lot of these type of id tech driven or powered rather, sort of like haunted house simulators, right? So it's a gorgeous looking game. You're haunted house, right? You're expecting there to be some type of apparitions or figures or something along those lines. And then there's naturally puzzles in the house that you need to solve. It has really phenomenal sound design, which we'll have much more to say about that later on. But I think what the game does so well, and what I was talking about with like the approach of my favorite walking simulators, is that it feels like a lived-in space first and foremost for the house. So a lot of it is the attention to like detail in the environment, making it feel like it is this lived-in space. You're going through and there's like boxes everywhere and everything, and then you're digging into like these family heirlooms. So there's this sense of, I suppose for Sam, like the sense of familiarity, but the player themselves obviously is brand new to this home and whatnot. So you can feel the sense of like, oh, some of these aspects of its design might be more relevant than we actually realize, or have more importance perhaps to them. But I think overall, like the game does such a good job, like from a presentation standpoint, and then the ability to layer more importance onto that environment is really what separates the approach to like the world building and the environment of Ludo, perhaps to some other like PT style clones where it's like, yeah, this looks good, but this house just feels like an empty house. Whereas Ludo, in the halls of it, you can kind of like feel the history, or at least feel the attention to, the importance of it to Sam himself.
And I think one of the best sort of early examples of that is when you get into his childhood room where he and his brother had been, and it's decked out like this sort of late 90s sort of room, like that, with the VHS, with that TV VHS combo machine basically thing. And the posters on the walls being these sort of like legally distinct versions of popular films of the video nasty era, and just like you've got those like gooey toys, like the hand slappy toys that used to have that are stuck to the ceiling, and the artwork that's there that they've done between them. And yeah, it feels like a room that has history. And I kind of said this on Blue Sky when I was playing it. It's like the TV plays George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, from beginning to end, because you've got to. If you've got the chance to make a small project and that's horror based, you've got the chance to just put that in there because you can do that for free. So yeah, I sat there and watched the whole of Night of the Living Dead in an in-game bedroom that was like a nostalgia treat in itself. Like it felt like being back in that sort of time period, which was straight away a thing that this is cool, very very particular to me, that I'm like, this is great. And the novelty of like watching it in that room was its own sort of thing, but it still kind of spoke to what they'd made with the game, in terms of like having this room that feels like you could just want just sit here watching my TV, watching a TV. It's perfectly fine. And I forgot that for a bit, which is quite remarkable. And so, and in the beginning of the game, you go past that room a lot, as these sort of loops happen, and you don't get to go until like you find out. We'll get into that as well. But when you find out that you have to do things in a certain order to be able to unlock that door and go in there, so it is like the first real proper treat the game gives you, in terms of like showing you more of like the history of this house beyond like the little incidental details that you've had in this like upstairs landing and down in the sort of the front of the house. Um, and this is the thing the game does well in general. I think is like it gives us such a small portion of the house, generally speaking, but as it goes on, it sort of opens up a little bit more, and then obviously changes and shifts depending on certain things in the story, but always sort of conveying those very key core parts of the house that you have to come back to time and again, which does feel more like a survival horror thing, like just going round in loops, back here, back there, unlocking little shortcuts effectively.
Hmm.
And yeah, so you get a familiarity with the house and learn the layout, and that's the thing of feeling comfortable in any home, isn't it? Where it's just repetition and getting ground places and familiarity, and considering the story being told about like basically trying to leave this place behind and not being able to, psychologically and physically, it's really fitting.
Yeah, I think for me, that is one of the aspects that immediately kind of like separated it from Visage for me, was the fact that I believe in Visage, like you can tackle the various like storylines in any order you want. You kind of have free range of the house. And in this, it was a little bit more streamlined, but I found that actually was, again, like reinforcing the aspect early on that I was quite taken with, which was the fact of the house and the lived in feel of it. And then getting to begin to uncover some of the things that, had occurred in Sam's past, what is clearly plaguing him, what may or may not be informing the supernatural happenings that he is experiencing and players experiencing at that. And so I think that the ability to have that sense of familiarity with the protagonist being the home, getting to delve into that history in a way that still feels very accessible to the player. And I think it's presented early on just enough of a hinting at what maybe could be going on here that the player feels like they can actually access that in a way that doesn't feel exclusionary, I suppose, right? You could kind of rope the player along for a long time if it was like, oh, well, there's a history here, but we're not going to reveal much of that for the majority of our experience. Whereas, as we'll get into, the various sort of, I suppose, things that Sam is grappling with, he has multiple examples in his life of things that he's still grappling with. So they can kind of like give the player those little breadcrumbs and then have that reveal before venturing into the next part of the house, which then gives you more of those breadcrumbs for the next reveal. So I found that Luto was paced quite well in that regard. But I'm curious, so again, we've chatted a couple of times about how Luto may resemble just being another PT clone. But for you, like, was there an aspect of design early on that kind of like dispelled that notion almost immediately, or like soon after you started playing it? Because for me, it was quite quick.
Yeah, I mean, it is very close to what you call a PT clone at first glance, as we sort of discussed. But in the sense that it sort of eases you in with a lot of mystery, but like I said before, if anything, it's more like What Remains of Edith Finch than PT. It's just the PT aspect is the loop and the looping, but even that's toyed with and done in a very different way. But yeah, the storytelling immediately struck me as being more like, okay, this is more of a personal story that doesn't feel entirely like it's going to be menacing and horrid and grim in that way. It's just going to have, you can have that stuff, but it doesn't have to be like traditional horror sort of grim stuff. That PT definitely deals with darker things in some respects. So and same is true of Visage and even Madison. But yeah, I don't know. I think it is because of the house straight away that you just get a sense of the kind of ghost story it is going to be, and even though it does surprise you still, I think going forward, I think it's the weird comfort, like of as we've just sort of discussed about the house being lived in, but obviously half packed away. It's like that weird in between, where it's like it does feel like you've stepped into somewhere you shouldn't have, but not in the same way of like you would normally think in a horror story, where it's oh god, shit, I shouldn't be here, sort of thing. More of a, I feel awkward to be here. I feel like I've invaded someone's sort of life, here like that. Even though Sam is in a family home here, he is still kind of has that feeling himself as well. So straight away, really good sort of communication there in terms of like setting you up to feel differently about it. There's still the odd bit here and there that's playing with that expectation, and it's a game that very much knows what people think it will be. And certainly early on with like the loops and setting up stuff like the air freshener gag to be like that sort of the Pavlov thing, where you just every time you hear it, you think, okay, so this is going to come back to get me at some point, isn't it? Like there's things, and in some ways it does, some ways it doesn't, but it never goes the way you would expect it to go, like that. And in your stuff like the thumping at the door and stuff like that, which there's always the threat of things, and we'll probably get into more of that towards the end when we're talking about just the game in general. But the assumption of a threat is the biggest thing in this game. What is more important to the story than actually having you be haunted and hounded by something constantly.
Yeah, for as deep into the mental health aspect that this narrative gets into, it was quite refreshing to play a game that tackles that subject matter that doesn't have an opening quite like, while I enjoy the game, like Visage is not very subtle, right? The beginning, spoilers for anybody that hasn't played Visage, the game literally begins with you putting a gun to your temple and blowing your head off. Like it's not the most subtle of lead-ins into a game that delves into, mental health struggles and whatnot. And so I think that that's probably one of the aspects of Luto that feels like a very just like appropriate way to lead into, again, very difficult subject matter for your narrative, in that you're not walking into a house and all of a sudden the house is immediately covered in blood, or you're finding like decapitated bodies or whatever have you, that you normally do in those types of haunted house games. It's quite literally just a house that's packed up. And as you said, the feeling of what has happened here, or a history here that could be ominous, but it's free of a lot of the staples that we usually see in genre, is probably one of the strongest aspects of, again, making not only the world approachable, but by in effect, the subject matter itself. And so I think in that regard, like Luto is not too upfront and does a good job, not only of kind of like containing what makes it special, but more importantly, I think that it's not just heavy-handed, which we've seen way too many examples of games that try to tackle similar subject matter or themes, are just so heavy-handed that at this point it feels for me like just lazy, or it just feels like a misunderstanding of how to actually tell a narrative in a way that's nuanced, that is able to not only entertain, but to also have a meaningful commentary, such as Ludo does. But I guess, PT is the obvious comparison point for this, but there's an aspect that really did catch me off guard, especially since I played the demo, which I believe was released in like 2022 or 2023 for this. So I played the demo, and I do remember it feeling pretty straightforward. But then when I played the game, what surprised me the most was, and this is a feature that was not in the demo, is that there's a narrator for this game, which completely took me by surprise in a way that I very seldomly am when playing games. Like I went into this blind in terms of I hadn't actually I hadn't kept up with the development at all. I was like, it was a haunted house demo that I played 2 years ago. And then to find out that there is a narrator that is, feels like it's channeling the Stanley Parable. That was one of those aspects of gameplay that I found was probably the most interesting addition to it, because initially I was like, well, is this going to be grating? Is this going to be trying too hard to either entertain, or is it going to typecast what I'm expecting to occur next? And it's just like, it tells you basically before you even get there. And I found the narration to be probably one of the strongest aspects to the storytelling here for Ludo, and the sort of overall I suppose, direction that this narrative takes. What did you think about that narration and the impact that it had on the experience of Ludo?
Yeah, well, we've just sort of been discussing how it would subvert certain ideas of what you would expect it to do, like that. And the narration, as surprising as it was to have it, is like quickly the idea seemed to be, oh, okay, so it's going to be that kind of game. It's going to do this and that with it. And while it is, as playful and sometimes untrustworthy as the narrator of something like Stanley Parable, it's handled in a very different way. And I like, the way it sort of plays out and gets sort of revealed about that aspect of it is definitely different, definitely more interesting than I expected. And yeah, it doesn't turn the game into what I feared it might for a bit. And I thought all this great sort of work to sort of build up this more, intimate story in so many ways. And I thought, God, is it just going to turn into a big twist moment, sort of like that? And I'm glad it doesn't really use that way. Like there are revelations, sure. Yeah, like there should be in a story like this, but they're not. Yeah, it's not like, oh my God sort of thing. Like
Yeah.
it's nothing to smack you in the face. But yeah, for a bit with that narration and some of the psychological sort of tricks that are going on in the game, I did think it was going to turn to a very different game, and I was so relieved it just swerved to an entirely different path. And like I said, this again is a game that knows all these tropes, all these ideas, all these things that we're very used to in certain types of horror games, and even in the sort of narrative-driven sort of adventure games known as walking sims. And yeah, plays with them, not just with the narrator, but with your expectations of what you would expect in any of those games. And yeah, having that narrator is a big part of that. Absolutely.
Yeah, it reminded me a lot of a game that we still need to chat about at some point in some depth. That being Indica, which is that game where you play a nun and basically you've got the devil and a less devilish being on your shoulders, essentially like whispering into your ear and trying to influence you and whatnot. And like that was the aspect that I kind of like related to the most. But I think that for me, like it's such a smart implementation of it because it is a big tell for sort of like the pivot that the game is going to take, not specifically, but more just like the fact that you're not able to trust anything the way it's presented to you initially. So I really like the fact that, at a certain point, the narrator takes this turn where, it starts off being just very like blunt, like this is what Sam is thinking. This is the environment he's in. And then you have a couple of moments that are like breaking the fourth wall. Like there's one point where I went to the menu after I'd started the game and was like messing around with the settings. And then all of a sudden the narrator goes, what does he say? He says something along the lines of like, that was weird. Sam stopped moving for a moment there or something like that. And it was just like, whoa, what the fuck? Like one of those moments that kind of catches you off guard, but then the ways in which he goes from being this very sort of just like straightforward narrator to all of a sudden there's like this sinister tone, and naturally the narrator takes a much more introspective and at times villainous type of a role the further into the house you explore, and furthermore the more that you're able to explore of Sam's past and that which is really sort of like making him suffer in a big way. So I think that that aspect of the storytelling again is complementary not only to the narrative as a whole, but I think also just like in informing the player about sort of like Ludo's inevitable rug pull that is coming. And I think it's still quite effective, despite the fact that you get the sense that like not everything can be believed or trusted on a first pass, and the fact that that's still able to have the sort of like stopping power that those moments do later on, I think is just overall like a testament to the developer here for this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the packaging is horror, and death being like the central theme is like such an important part of horror. But as I said before, it is just utilizing these things to tell the story in a very particular way, and like the same with the mental health stuff, as you said, dealing with much more than the obvious stuff that normally goes into it. We know about impression we know about the suicide, but the greater effects on a person, like that, and especially dealing with grief as well. That's yeah, we'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. But yeah, those are all aspects of this game that sort of really build it, in a way that when you do get to that sort of conclusion, it doesn't feel it feels earned in a way that you didn't expect.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think maybe we'll take a quick break. And when we come back, we can dive more into overall, unpacking the thematics of Ludo, because that really is sort of I suppose, the bread and butter of what makes this such an outlier from, so many of those PT clones as we've been talking about. So we can chat about sort of unpacking those thematics. Maybe we can do a little spoiler chat. And at the same time, like, this is, a haunted house game. And I found that this game actually did navigate the sort of more traditional horror genre moments better than, again, some of its counterparts. So we can dive into all that and more when we come back from our break in a moment. And we're back from our break. And I guess starting with the fact that Ludo basically translates to in mourning or grieving in Spanish. So, and as we've alluded to, it is not a surprise that this is a game that deals with some pretty heavy subject matter, right? The fact that essentially what is transpiring is that Sam is grappling with the fact that he has had various instances of loss in his life. And, all loss is traumatic in different ways. But at the same time, like, this is very clearly like a manifestation of this grief, and going through these supernatural and, surreal instances that are unfolding within the halls of the home are all a reflection of that, and his inability to, either whether it's move on, whether it's accept, what have you. So, I think for me, like, the aspect of Ludo's unpacking all of those aspects, again, kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier, in that the game doesn't feel too heavy-handed, I think, in any one regard. Naturally, as we said, the further into your understanding of what's going on, the house naturally is going to have more hauntings or supernatural instances. But, for me, I found that it was paced out well enough and didn't blatantly like spell anything out too much. That it really did sustain sort of the entire runtime of this for me. How did you kind of feel about that balancing of revelation, scares, and ultimately being able to kind of like overcome or begin or hopefully overcome Sam's inability to move on?
Yeah, I mean, as any story like this, being so sort of discombobulating and swerving little different ways that you don't expect without being showy, it does leave you thinking initially, like, well, how does this connect to that, and like that, and you have a simple grasp of what's going on with the story, and obviously the basic details of his losses and how they are, but it kind of makes you think about the rest of it and go, well, why does that mean this? Why does this mean that? And it's like, that's the task the game then has, is to make those like individual moments and certain levels, if you will, just sort of snap together and make sense in the wider context. And rare for me for a game like this, where it kind of made me think about it all a bit more in terms of like, what did this mean? What did that mean? And without it being like, one of those, not one of those general public inception sort of things that like, I feel so smart because I understand this film sort of thing. It's general. It's just it's kind of cool to think about how they manifested these certain aspects of how Sam feels, and like I said, it being not so much just grief about what he's lost in terms of people, but like what he's lost of himself. Like, which is the big thing. It's confronting death on multiple levels, which is what it leaves behind, and the death of who you want to be, as well. Like the regret of like death basically encroaching on what you wanted to do in life and how you wanted to approach life, and all that sort of coming together to be the reason behind this sort of torment he's putting himself through. Like that's it makes more sense. It's never just about in very simple sort of Silent Hill terms of with my wife was sick, I didn't really much care for that, so I killed her sort of thing. It's like it's like that. And no, for some reason I've forgotten, but no, it is a very relatable sort of thing of like you want to feel one, grief for people clearly and things that matter to you, but it isn't always just people. It's about what you want, who you want it to be, and
Mm.
yeah, that's I think certainly for myself. Yeah, at this age now, it is one of those things that sort of hits a bit harder. Where you're thinking, yeah, I could have done this, I could have done that, and it's like
Mm.
if only this hadn't happened or that thing hadn't happened. It's very easy to sort of wallow in that, and coupled with just general grief and going into a home that has so many of these memories that will hurt as much as they help.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the perfect, the realistic depiction of a haunted house in that regard. You are just
Mm.
you are just going over a house that has the stain effectively of the people you knew, like that, and not knowing if you can let that go, like that, and but also frustration about that. Repetition is used a lot in this game, as a device to sort of not only invoke the fear of change, but the opposite as well. Like that, it's because it is a conflicting in Sam's head, like sort of what he wants. So yeah, it's a game that really does just manage to balance these things surprisingly well. Like
Mm.
yeah, your mileage may vary in terms of like how perfectly you think it kind of knits together. Maybe it isn't. I think there are messier aspects to it in trying to get to that point. But I think all roads lead to the ultimate conclusion of the story, which is fine, and that's all really needed.
Yeah, that's a good point. For someone that unfortunately is inundated as much death as our protagonist here is, um, I think for me, like again, like the various maybe it's not even like the various types of things that he's dealing with, whether it's grief, whether it's regret and whatnot. But I think it's more about the ways in which you're able to kind of like investigate that. And one of the aspects of that I think really strengthens a protagonist who, is initially only defined by their tragedies. It seems, he doesn't have a voice
Mm.
himself to expound on what he's experiencing or anything along those lines. But you get to really understand Samuel and explore, more importantly, like his emotions um, through his personal interests, right? Which is a big one of them is like um, film, like
Mm.
symbolism throughout film, which is like one of the major themes of this, or I suppose maybe, I don't know if it's a theme, but like stylistic uh, devices within this game. You
Yeah,
have this guy that is interested in screenwriting and he's interested in directing and he's interested in storyboarding. And so there's different ways in which that hobby or those interests are translated in the storytelling here. Like what's the most important one probably, which is the drawings that you find periodically of his,
yeah,
which, can tie into not only puzzles, but they can also kind of begin to shed light on uh, what's going on and sort of like leading into the narrative that's unfolding that might be tied to one of any number of tragedies that he's experienced, right? But then there's also, I think, just stylistic aspects in the sense of like the game being presented with, like what is it? It's like cinema bars basically
yeah,
in those cutscenes, right? And so you have those, and then you actually have a literal script that plays out periodically when you have those big reveals at the end of sort of like the revelation behind one of those traumatic deaths that he's experienced, right? And so I think that in and of itself is like a really smart way to give a character that literally doesn't have a voice. While we will inevitably learn that the narrator is basically just like the subconscious, but I think that ultimately, like these little aspects are what make a character that doesn't actually get to speak for themselves, like actually quite memorable and meaningful. And that is one of the aspects of a walking simulator that I think you only get in a walking simulator, which is that you can have these types of like very stylistic devices that can be um, resemblant of their interests or viewing the world through their like let's say lexicon almost. So for me, like that was one of those really strong aspects of the presentation here.
Yeah, I think the through line of like his interests are very interesting to this game, and especially with the narrator, as you said, it makes the whole thing sort of click a bit more when you get more information about his interests and what he likes. You get hints of it all from very early on. Like I said, when you go to the childhood room and you see how obsessed he was. And yeah, I suppose you could see it all as being a two-way thing. The frustration of not getting to be that person and wanting to be that person, but also like it's his mind's way of working all these things out in his head and like using the tools he knows best, like that. And I suppose that's it kind of alludes to, he has not really been able to do it like he wanted to, and not really been able to delve into it in many a year. So it's almost like the reason he doesn't quite understand, and we don't understand what's going on for a while, in terms of how these things connect, is because he's not kind of figured it out. He's just basically like, just planning, in his head without subconsciously, without really realizing quite where it's going. But so again, one of those things, multiple levels. It's that sort of creative process, the frustration of the creative process, the inner voice that tells you what you can and can't do, and the self doubt is in there, and the how it almost feels like an adversarial sort of figure, in that sense. And yeah, that's one of the most satisfying things, I think, as you do come towards the end of it, and why, again, when I say like the threats of this game not being real to it, not really being anything that's going to properly attack you, because he's ultimately his own worst enemy in that regard. He's the only threat here, to himself. And I think the handling of the ghost thing especially is like, because this game is like paved with like cheated ghost type figures like that. And again, much like the air freshener gag, like the amount of times they'll just be there and not moving like that, and you just keep waiting for that very typical horror thing of just being jump scared like that. But the only times they happen, in this game, are literally just where one swoops down with a little sticky note on their face as a face like that, which is goofy and silly. And as we learn through the story, it's like there's a good reason for that, like that. I won't delve too deep there because I know we're giving some bits away, but I think that was a rather sweetly sort of handled way of that, the whole thing like that. And I could see how that would frustrate people if they want like a very typical sort of ghost story experience, like, oh, well, it's not doing this, it's not doing that. It's like, no, it is just going on the more sort of traditional sort of idea of a haunting, not just being, oh God, I'm terrified, it's a ghost after me sort of thing. It's like, they're there always, around you, and like they are what you make of them sort of thing. And the fact that so many of them are just inanimate effectively, that is a key part of this story.
Well, I think also like it speaks to just I suppose like, and I don't want people to like read too much into this, but like a mature version of a haunting story, right? Because that's always been the essence of haunted house story, has always been the fact that like, I suppose the caveat there being is that like when it's a haunted house that has some kind of connection to a protagonist, it hasn't been about the scary shit that's happening. It's been about whatever has caused those things to happen, which is not too dissimilar from, just a regular random family moving into a haunted house, but more specifically like here, this is the right approach to take, whereas that the emphasis is all on the events rather than the immediate in your face ramifications for that event, which might be a ghost sheet figure running at you with a sticky note on its face. That being said, like I found that there aren't a terrible amount of jump scares in this game, but I found that they were much more impactful than a lot of other haunted house games I've played, because of the fact that they're so few and far between. And at the end of the day, it's playing with one type of figure, which is, again, it looks like somebody that has, the Michael Myers ghost sheet over their head, which the fact that that is the one recurring like haunting piece of imagery in this game, and the fact that each time you encounter it, they react or they have a different type of scare associated with them, like that is the best aspect of the jump scare here, is that it constantly keeps you guessing despite the fact that you're seeing the same thing, the same figure over and over. It's the type of thing where like if you had multiple types of figures or apparitions or what have you, yeah, you're expecting something new. So the fact that every time that I see just the same looking figure, I'm like, oh, I know the one or two ways they're going to behave. And then you come to that one instance where you walk towards it and it crawls up the ceiling backwards. Like that fucking freaked me out in a way that I wasn't expecting, because of the fact previously they hadn't done anything even nearly as creepy like that. So I think that that really is the right sort of approach here. And, you know, there's always going to be people that are pissed off by the fact that like, oh, this game's not inundated with scares. And it's like, yeah, that's not the point. The scares that are here really are like a bonus to what Luto actually is and what Luto should be praised for. So in that regard, like going just from the like traditional haunted house jump scare sense, I still find Luto is quite effective in just how infrequently it utilizes those moments.
Yeah, and I think it borrows quite in a more sort of surreal way, something quite interesting from his Resident Evil 7, you know, the tapes
Mm.
and like being like their unplayable things effectively. Where here there are a couple of sections where you literally just there's a TV and there's a sort of TV VCR that you have in the boy's room, and yeah, you basically play through that TV rather than, you know, so you're playing through sections that you've been in, and all the while all the ghostly figures there, and it's like so you've got this grainy sort of VHS sort of first person found footage thing going on within the game, and they're really creepy. You know, like even though effectively nothing terrible happens in them, it's just like the unease of like how dark it already is, and the fuzzy vision that it gives it is like, oh yeah, it's like it's certainly one of those moments where like you kind of say oh like that when you're standing in front of it and you just see the image and then you realize that oh I can move in the TV, and then it's like sure, it's not to say that's not been done before, but I think in the context of everything else we've been saying about this game and the character of Sam and what his interests are, it is like a really cool sort of mini thing to be able to sort of walk through these things to solve a puzzle effectively, you know, like and
Yeah.
affect the world you're in by going through like this recorded movie version of it. And yeah, so I think the fact that the ghost figures remain unsettling for most of the game it is quite the achievement, especially considering those jumpy moments that do occasionally feel a little goofy out of context. Yeah, it's just that because of that expectation. It's like, and I said, it goes back to that thing of expectations with this game. Like, of we're gonna, oh yeah, spooky ghost figure, but we're gonna put it everywhere. You know, like towards the end of the game, there are just sections where they're fucking everywhere, like that, and it's just like it doesn't feel. It's still like waiting for something, one of them to just suddenly move. And occasionally, you do get those moments where you turn around and there's one section of that hallway where every time you turn around, it's following you, but you never see it move, sort of thing, which is a very classical sort of ghost story thing. But again, it's just the anticipation, the fear of something that might happen like that, which again ties into this sort of psychological feeling. Yeah. So yeah, there's plenty of good, you know, creepy stuff in this game like that. I suppose like it's the story itself that, you know, with the full context of it, that you may feel cheated, perhaps if you feel like there was no worth in those moments or you didn't get the payoff. Which yeah, it's understandable because you're not to know going in that that's the kind of game it is. But yeah, I think it's important in a way to know that, you know, that's it's not a failing of the game. That's just the game chose a very particular artistic vision and went with it, and that just happened to be playing against type at times.
Yeah. You know, ultimately, I think for a game such as this, it's going to be divisive because of that fact, right? The fact that it is defying the expectations of this particular subgenre. I find that again, like a lot of games that set out to do something like this, they might dabble in some of the subject matter, but at the end of the day, like their primary emphasis seems to be on scaring rather than um, communicating a narrative that maybe delves a little bit deeper into the human psyche, which again is like the real root of psychological horror, right? It's not just that it's not, it seems like the oversimplification of a lot of psychological horror is like, well, this person's bothered by something, so we're going to create the most fucked up world imaginable, which at the end of the day, like the real root of it is what is plaguing them and why they are unable to move on from that. And I think that that for me is what allows Ludo's narrative to like work so well, is the fact that, you know, when you start to unpack some of the things that Sam has experienced, like the root of everything feels very grounded in the way that it should be when you're discussing this type of subject matter, like grief and these things. You know, when he's talking about experiencing, I think it was his father having a heart attack and dying, like he has this notion of like, I should have done more. I could have done something. Could I even have done anything? Right. And it's like the way in which those are presented, this like thought process and this obsessive sort of like inability to move on from what if, even if at the end of the day, like you're completely powerless in a majority of those situations. I find that that examination is presented in a way that's very genuine and it's communicated in a way that like, I don't know if authentic is the way to say it, but it just feels like it is not necessarily like leaning too heavily on genre, if that makes sense. Like, as we've said, there have been plenty of haunted house games that have tried similar things, but it's like, again, it's so heavy handed, or it's so heavy handed in terms of like the horror genre imagery. Whereas here, it's like, no, it's utilizing this environment that is not necessarily drab, but it's definitely got this air that like something has occurred here. And so leaning more into understanding the what that thing was and humanizing it, I think is what just makes Ludo's examination of that, and again, like further exploring the environment, so affecting.
Yeah, and I think because much of it is manifested from Sam's like mental state in terms of like his memories and his frame of reference being his clear love of like genre movies and stuff like that. So obviously that's what it's all going to manifest as, is stuff that feels akin to that. But I do wonder, like with the his struggle and frustration of not being able to be creative like he used to, and it not being like it was, is the like the sheep ghost thing. It's like him not being able to manifest something worse or terrifying because he just doesn't have that creative spark to imagine it, because the other stuff is like more of a problem in this case. So yeah, it's great to be able to think of things like that in a game like this. So it's fascinating in so many ways. I was very roundly surprised by it. It's one of those games where at first I was like, just the story's hooking me, but I'm not sure the progress is going at the speed I want it to just yet. But I was just saying this about Chronos, which we'll talk about at a later date. Where it's getting to the rhythm of what a game is and does, that sometimes can just you have to give it the chance and the time to sort of unveil what it's doing properly before you can sort of go, no, not for me, because you can miss out very easily like that. But it was such a delight, and I was so wonderfully surprised by it. And I think there was definitely something in the fact that, considering what it looked like and all the things that the trailer shows that obviously play into those expectations, I don't know what it was about it that instantly made me go, I want to play it, sort of thing. Because I said I'm not like massively eager to play those kind of games, because I think so many have done it so poorly in that time. And looking good's great, but I do think it's just that it straight away gave off the vibe that it wasn't going to be one of those games, which the wording is important, I think, in those trailers, and they really do sort of inform on some level that no, it's not going to be that. But even though they are showing you in some ways the opposite of that.
No, I think that it is really the type of experience that purposefully maybe looks as you would expect it to, but then it pretty early on like gives you these little like kernels of an indication, like, no, there's actually a lot more here under the surface. And there is so much to this game that I think is worth exploring for the player on their first time, and just kind of like having that sort of wonder to it. So I guess, do you think it's worth even delving into like spoiler chat about maybe that sort of like finale and reveal, or do you think that maybe we could just like talk a little bit of alluding to it, in the sense of like, oh, this is a game that actually like is taking these various feelings and incorporating them into like unique ways in which the world is perceived within?
I think for the benefit of anyone who hasn't played it yet, I
Yeah.
think, and yes, we've given some things away, but
Mhm.
I think with everything we've said so far,
Mhm.
you can play the game, play that ending, and probably get a good idea of what we're thinking in terms of that and what it does, especially in terms of like how it handles like the mental health side of things.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll leave that bit, just because I think that's key to sort of knitting it all together. And for all the complaints people may have had about that type of game, the story is an experience, and you experiencing the story is the point. Far more than watching a video of it.
Yeah.
Playing it is the whole point. It's putting you in those shoes, putting you in those environments. It's that one thing games have over the other mediums, is like
Mm.
they put you in the place. You are in some way in control of those things going on, and while there is scripted stuff, sure, you are in it, in a way that you can't be with a film or television or even books. It's different, and it's a game that very much plays to that strength.
Absolutely. And I think like the last thing I'll say in terms of the mental health aspect and the exploration of that is that it is so refreshing to play a game where the protagonist has nothing to do with the deaths themselves outside of their relation to those people, right? How many times have we played games that try to psychological horror games that dabble with themes such as regret or depression and these things? And then, it ends up being like the protagonist made a mistake and they had a direct hand in the person's death, which, has worked in plenty of games. But at the same time, once you play enough experiences like that, it just feels a little overly dramatized, if you will. But here, like Samuel just being a person that has experienced these deaths from, natural circumstances, whether it's an accident, whether it's illness, whether it's age, like that, I think does a greater service to the type of story that's being told here, in that the examination of it again feels very grounded, even if we see some of this haunting imagery and whatnot, which is that person's perception of maybe internally how they feel or how the world is to them. So that was just like one of those aspects, both narratively and also thematically, that I found to be very refreshing with Ludo's approach. And I think furthermore, it just allows the supernatural aspects to feel more effective because of the fact that you're not so inundated with those types of typical moments throughout the entire experience. There's a good variety to it. And, like I said, they're few and far between those instances. So each time they do occur, I feel like they have the punch that they should normally have. But, so many people overly rely on those to kind of like emphasize their point, that by the end of whatever experience it is, you're kind of just like, yeah, I got it. This person's in a real bad way, and this is their examination of that, which is not how I felt about Ludo at all, because of
No.
just how like even-handed it was in that regard. But yeah,
Absolutely.
as we've said, this is a game that is not afraid to break the fourth wall in its examination of things, and overall, just like it does the legwork in a big way for actually examining these different themes that at this point we've experienced in plenty of games. But here it's doing it in a way that's maybe a little bit more thoughtful, and is complementary to the vessel of genre, which is something we always talk about, without having an over reliance on it. Like it feels like it has something to say in addition to these scary jump scares that are, sort of a representation of somebody's mental state, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess Luto is definitely one of those games that, as we've found with several games such as this, it is best to experience these kind of like revelations on your own, but just know going into it that, like, I would say for the most part, this has the payoff that you would want if you're looking for something that's akin to PT or almost akin to, a design choice from the Stanley Parable, but has a little bit more to say to it. And I think, some people maybe might get hung up on the puzzles, or they might get hung up on perhaps how everything is interwoven at the end of the day. But I think overall, like, in this examination of a world that's supposed to be reflective of someone's own internal sort of like turmoil, it quite often is quite successful in that regard. So I'm glad you brought this one to the table this week for us to chat about, because it's one that, while I went into it blind since I played that demo all those years ago, it was great to kind of see the various additions and changes that they had made to it, because I think that played a big role in it, kind of like circumventing the pitfalls of this subgenre that we've seen time and time again.
Yeah, very much so.
But that's going to do it for our chat this week on Ludo. And as always, my friend, it's a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
Back at you until the next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Safe Room. If you enjoy the show, please rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter and Blue Sky at Safe Room Pod for show updates. As always, our main episodes of Safe Room drop every Monday, but our bite-sized episodes of Horror Bites, our indie horror showcase, drop every Thursday. You can follow the Horror Bites Twitter account at horrorbites_SR. You can join our Discord channel, Safe Room Podcast, to chat with us and other horror fans about the genre we all love. And finally, you can send emails to saferoompod@gmail.com if you'd like to share your thoughts on a game we have or are going to cover. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.